we've alluded to this, but I want to dive into it and get your thoughts on how, media representations of women can actually lead to real world social
Hmm.
change, right? And you talked about how this storyline about a woman contemplating and going through on an abortion was like not long before Roe versus Wade, right? So it's like we see these things on TV, and then we see a reflection, like there's maybe a symbiotic relationship happening there. Can you explain, the research and work you do, how TV has actually contributed to changing societal expectations and norms, especially around gender roles and gender equality over the decades?
Yeah, we human beings, right? We are creatures who learn socially. That's so much of what we
Hmm.
learn about who we are and how to be in our social world is
Yeah.
through what is immediately around us. And if it's not immediately around us, we then have to go looking for versions of it somewhere else. And television becomes, for so many of us in so many ways, right? One of our
Hmm.
only windows onto what life is like in different places and from different
Yeah.
perspectives and that
Sure.
sort of thing. And so this is why the way in which people's experiences get represented on TV becomes so significant because it can be some people's only access to what it is like to be somebody other than themselves. And there's a media studies scholar who studied television specifically extensively named George Gerbner. And he came up with what he called cultivation theory. And his theory has been used most often to unpack this idea that violence on television causes violence in the real world, right?
Hmm.
But
And there's
the
been lots
idea
of
can,
conversation on that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But his arguments can be really usefully applied to all sorts of other things. And he suggests
Hmm.
that ongoing, repeated exposure to the same kinds of images and stories and perspectives can cultivate in us a different perspective, right? Or a
Hmm.
fuller understanding. And so it's not as straightforward as we watch one episode of Sex in the City and all of a sudden, life for women changes everywhere. But it's more
Yeah.
this kind of gradual accumulation of representations that push at the boundaries of our social norms that
Hmm.
over time can help our own understandings of what is normal and ordinary become bigger and
Right.
bigger and broader and broader.
Hmm.
And,
And I
yeah.
think we can see that, like, even you talked the conversation we had at the beginning of, like, from the 50s to the 70s, what women look like in the house. And one that just came to mind is even Will and Grace and the depiction of gay men. That was such an introduction, right? Up and juxtapose that with Schitt's Creek, where that, like, homosexual love was just completely normal. Like, there was no tension narrative. There was no storyline about how difficult and horrible that was. Whereas Will and Grace address that directly, right? So you can see over that time period, social values and norms around um, LGBTQ issues change dramatically. So it's fascinating how powerful storytelling is, and how powerful, like, TV as an agent for social change can be. In terms of feminist activism, which is a little bit more like
Mm.
active, right? Because as we're saying, like, nobody would, in hindsight, scholars, and I'm going back to Buffy because I loved it. In hindsight, scholars would say, Buffy was a feminist narrative, or they would go back and you apply this lens to it, right? So that's kind of a little bit more passive, I think. But in terms of actual feminist activism, how has the portrayal of feminist ideas and issues evolved on TV? Because this is sort of like a radical thing that women did, right? To now kind of, like you said, like normalize, like it's just a point of view in the world. So how have you seen that shift in recent years?
Yeah, right. And television, I am biased as a television studies scholar who loves it very, very much.
Yes.
But it is a really great place to look to see our own changing willingness to talk about
Hmm.
these sorts of things in these very sort of public places,
Right.
right? And from like the 50s, when television was deliberately trying to act as a sort of agent of change in terms of putting women back into domestic spaces,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in very subtle ways of showing women, like Leave It to Beaver, being so happy there.
Yeah.
To storylines in the 70s of women very explicitly and forthrightly calling themselves feminists, and this
Mm-hmm.
being part of the storyline. And we have ended
Right.
up somewhere now that sort of moves back and forth between a few different ways of thinking about how we want to label feminist activism and feminist media. And one of these gets the category of post-feminism. This idea that we
Right.
have made it through the feminist movement, it has been successful, we are good, we are done, we don't really need to talk about it in these terms anymore. Everybody knows equality is here to stay, right?
Yeah.
And then we have third wave feminism and what some people are wondering could even count as fourth wave feminism that is arguing a little bit differently of there are still big systemic structural obstacles for women out there that we still need to be agitating about.
Right.
And so
Yeah, we're not
what we
done
tend-
yet.
We're not done. We're nowhere near done.